Does Judaism prescribe a specific economic system?
There is no doubt that the Torah does not describe a specific economic system. Nor is there any doubt that the Torah recognizes and in fact stresses the importance of the individual, the intrinsic worth and sovereignty of the individual, and what today at least is referred to as the human rights of the individual. In fact, this is a point to note at the outset of this discussion, that the modern concept of human rights is really something which could only have developed from the sources of the Torah. It is because the Torah stresses that the human being is created in the image of God, and that is to say that there is a certain unique aspect to human existence which does not exist in any other part of the animal kingdom. There is no other form of life which possesses these spiritual faculties and this intelligence and spiritual intellect in order to connect with the divine. It is precisely for that reason that the human being cannot be simply done away with or violated or trodden underfoot. And this concept comes directly from the Torah, in actual fact. This would be, I have no doubt, a surprise to many human rights activists throughout the world, most of whom probably do not believe in the Torah, do not believe in God for that matter. But the truth of the matter is that their outlook and their belief in human rights is not something which stems from a purely Darwinian biological view of existence, because according to that view, why should there be any intrinsic value to a human being? Why should one human being not take advantage of, act immorally, or even murder another human being in order to achieve what he wants, if that is what he is motivated to do by this or that drive or desire or will, which, according to a pure, hardcore Darwinian, is the result of Darwinian evolution, and therefore it is intrinsic to the nature of this being, this human being, that he should want and desire to do these things. Why is it irrational or improper or immoral for him to do whatever he can to achieve those aims and to fulfill those needs and those desires as he sees fit? In fact, the concept of morality itself cannot really be explained in Darwinian terms at all. The entire concept of human rights and individual freedom, the right to choose, amongst other things, and this brings us back to the discussion of economic systems, the right to choose how one makes a living and how one is to act, how one chooses to act, what kind of role one chooses to play in the marketplace. All this is connected to the value of the individual human being, and this is a concept rooted in the statement at the very beginning of the Torah, the book of Genesis, that Hashem created, the Creator created human beings in His own image, that is to say, with a special and unique intellect and spiritual faculty. And He, the Creator, instructs us and demands of us to live according to a moral code. So on the one hand, there is no doubt that the Torah supports these ideas of the rights of the individual, the freedom of the individual to live his life and to be an economic being as he sees fit. The concept of the collective, or the society, or the regime, the government, deciding for everybody what they should do, in what field they should work, how they should be allowed to act from an economic perspective, that everything is taken from the individual, all autonomy and all essentially self-worth is denied to the individual in favor of the collective, which is the other economic system, if we're talking about the two systems of capitalism and communism or socialism. This second idea, that the collective is paramount and that the only meaning and value that can be attached to an individual is an expression of and a result of that individual's part within the collective, that idea cannot be supported from any Torah source. That is the first point that we need to understand. We see in the Torah, for example, time and time again, a society that is described by the Torah, and that which also appears in the Nevi'im and the prophets, in the books of Yoshua, Joshua, and Shofetim, Judges, and Shemuel, Samuel, and Melachim, Kings, for example. We see a society that is based on what we would today describe as a private enterprise, and a system based on the ability and the right, the innate right of individual to earn his living as he sees fit. Of course, in ancient times, land was the central and most important economic resource. Of course, today it still is a very central and economic resource, but it's not the only essential economic resource. In ancient times, it was the essential economic resource because the way to produce food for human beings was by, on the one hand, agriculture, growing crops, and on the other hand, animal husbandry, to provide meat, cheese, milk, eggs, etc. And all of this requires land. Now, land, according to the Torah, in ancient times, the land of Israel was divided amongst the tribes, and within the tribes it was divided amongst clans and families, so that every family unit was supposed to have its own plot of land in order to sustain itself, to produce crops, to sell, to barter, etc. This was the essential system. There is no hint at all of a collectivism. On the other hand, it's equally true that already in the Torah itself, for example, in the book of Ruth, in the Megillah of Ruth, we see clearly the ideas and institutions which appear in the Torah itself, which are then, we see, instituted and practiced in the times of the judges, in the time of Ruth, that the poor were also taken into account, and they were allowed, therefore, to gather sheaves of wheat, etc., barley that had fallen onto the ground during the harvest. In other words, certain parts of the produce at the corners, the ends of the field, and things that had fallen along the wayside and what have you, these things were left and had to be left by Torah law for the poor. This is one example of the care which a normative Jewish society based on Torah values, the care that it showed its more unfortunate members. There was no Ayn Rand type of disdain and lack of care for the unfortunate, for the poor. That's not to say, of course, that the Torah promotes indolence and cheating and any form of immoral behavior live off the fruits of others. That's certainly not the case. But on the other hand, it does not view a person who finds himself in very dire economic straits. We do not view such a person as a criminal or someone who deserves no compassion or assistance. In fact, we are instructed by the Torah in a way which one does not find in any other civilization or legal or cultural system. We are instructed and obligated, according to the Torah, to care for the needy and to provide charity and assistance as required. With regards to sadaqah, charity, which is, in fact, the word or translation, charity, is a poor translation, as we will presently explain. In this regard, Rambam writes as follows. This is in Ilchot Matnoth Aniyim, Perek Tish'i, the 9th chapter, the beginning. Kol ir sheyesh ba Yisrael, any city or town or village where there are Jews, there is a community of Jews living there. Hayovim la'ha'amid mehem gaba'e sadaqah. The Jewish community, as a community, is required to set up a system for assisting the needy. Regarding such a system, Rambam goes on to say, Anoshim yudu'im wa na'manim. The people who run such a system must be known to be trustworthy and honest, because obviously such a system is going to require the taking of money, of funds from some people, the majority of the citizenry, and dispersing those funds to the needy. And this requires obviously both judgment and discernment as to who should receive what, and it also requires a very impeccable type of honesty and integrity. And the way things were done, as Rambam goes on to describe, is that there were two basic concepts or procedures. One procedure was to go around from home to home. In other words, the people in charge of the communal charity fund would go from home to home, Erev Shabbat, on every Friday before Shabbat, and they would require every household to pay a certain amount of money, not according to whatever the household or the head of the household chose to give. And that's exactly where the word charity falls short in terms of describing what we are discussing here. Charity usually, as generally understood in English, refers to a voluntary act of kindness, and the extent of that kindness, the amount of money that a person chooses to give to the needy, is up to him. But in fact, this is not what we're discussing here. Here we're discussing a system where the Beit Din, the court, which also has to exist in any Jewish town or community, which is there to regulate and decide the essential issues which lie at the core of running a proper Jewish community. The Beit Din, based on some form of estimate as to the economic ability and wealth of every household, they set an amount that each household is required to pay every week, every Erev Shabbat. وَهَنْ مَحَلَكِمَ مَعُوث هَنْ مَحَلَكِمَ مَعُوث مِعَرَبْ شَبَّث عَرَبْ شَبَّث. And every Friday they disperse these funds to the poor. وَنُثْنِمْ لَخُلْ عَنِي وَعَنِي مُزَنَوْثَ مَسْبِكِينَ لِشِبْعَةِ يَمِيمٍ. And they give to every poor person or family that which is required for their basic sustenance for the next 7 days. وَزَوْيَ هَنِكْرَيْث كُپَّا شَلَ صَدَقَةً. And this is referred to by the Chachamim as the Kupa, the Community Charitable Fund. So we see that the idea of communal responsibility for the needy is very much in evidence in the Torah and in the Jewish way of life. It is not something secondary. It is not something left up to the individual to decide exactly what he will do. If someone were to say, for example, well, that sounds very draconian and it doesn't sound very libertarian, one could simply point out that the very same thing, in another way of course, is done in almost every country on earth nowadays, and it's called income tax. And of course there are other kinds of taxes. There's VAT taxes on purchases and many items, basic commodities such as fuel, for example, in many countries is very highly taxed in order to provide the government with the necessary funds to take care of all kinds of requirements that the nation, the country, or individual communities may require. And of course, in some countries you have federal systems where you have a federal government and a state government, and you have local governments, you have municipal councils, etc. So the idea of city rates and income tax and other forms of taxation, this in itself is not an unusual idea. This is broadly accepted throughout the world. The Jewish people have always had such a system, and the system described in the Mishnah and in the Talmud does not refer to a national system. It refers to a communal system based on a city or a town, etc. Probably because the Jewish people during most of that period, the period of the Mishnah and the Talmud, were not a sovereign independent nation, and therefore it was not relevant or possible to implement any kind of system for national governments and therefore also national social security or things of this nature. One could make the argument that today that the Jewish people have returned en masse to their land, and we do have a functioning modern sovereign state, that what we should be doing is deciding based on our own understandings and concepts and values based on the Torah. Not necessarily should we be following the example of other nations. We should examine these issues of how to raise taxes and what form of social security payments should be paid to whom, for what, how this should be raised, how this should be dispersed. There is such a system in Israel today, but it's not necessarily in all respects based on Torah principles and values. But the idea, the essential idea, that the community has a responsibility and an obligation to care for the needy and the poor is without a doubt a central aspect of Judaism. One could also add, parenthetically, that these ideas made their way into other civilizations and other religions from the Torah. They spring from the Torah, but they were accepted in other parts of the world, by other societies, by other nations. A good example is Islam, which of course in its essential aspects is based entirely on Torah concepts and values and precepts that were picked up by Muhammad in Arabia in his time, in the 7th century, from constant contact that he had with tribes of Jews and Jewish merchants who lived in Arabia at that time. And not only the idea of monotheism did he hear and pick up from these Jews, he also heard and saw the concept of sadaqah, which in Arabic is called, in Islamic parlance, is referred to as zakat, which is exactly the same idea. It is a formal, obligatory form of tithing, of giving charity to deal with and assist the poor. And in some parts of the Christian world also some form of this practice was in place in different periods of history. Now, we mentioned that there were two procedures in place, which are described in the Mishnah and in the Talmud in detail, regarding caring for the needy. One was the weekly tithing system, which was obligatory and which was regulated by the Beth Din, and they sent out, together with the people in charge of the charitable fund, the Kupasha Sadaqah. It was their job to go around and from household to household once a week and raise that amount of money that each household was deemed able and obligated to pay. There was also a daily form of sadaqah, of charity, and the Rambam describes this in the next halakha. He says, وَخَيْنْ مَعْمِدِيم قَبَائِيم شَلُقْحِيم بِخُلْ يَوْمْ وَيَوْمْ. In the same way, certain individuals or a system is put in place for receiving food. Usually this was in the form of actual food. In other words, in each home meals were being cooked on a daily basis, and they would cook a little bit more than they would require, so that they would be able to give to these people coming around daily to collect foodstuffs that would then be, or it could also be money. It wouldn't have to be in the form of food. Sometimes it was, and other times it was simply a small, much more modest daily amount. As Rambam writes here, they would take every day mikol haser, from every courtyard, from every home, path, which is bread, uminei ma'achalu feroth, and different types of food, or ma'oth, or money, bimishahu mitnadev lefi sha'ah. This was not an absolute obligation. This was something that was left to the individual, to the household, to decide how much it would give, and if in fact it would give at all. This is a nadava. This is something that a person chooses to do. And at the end of each day, that which was raised on that day in the town, in the community, would be given out to needy individuals. We're talking here about people who literally did not have what to eat and would go hungry. So they were not allowed to go to sleep hungry. They were given food or money at the end of the day to buy some food. And this was more in the way of emergency aid for the needy, people who are truly right now requiring a square meal. And each individual who was deemed and assessed to be worthy and needy to that extent was given enough to sustain him for that day. And this was called tamhui. So we have these two procedures that were in place. And Rambam goes on to say further, and this is perhaps the most important statement in these lines that we have quoted now. In Halakha Gimel, Rambam writes, Mi'olam lo ra'inu wa lo shamanu. Never have I, when he uses the plural, but he says doesn't mean we necessarily, but he means Jews in general, and I particularly. The Rambam is writing, speaking of his own experience. He says, I've never seen or heard of any community, Bekahal mi Yisrael, she'en lahem kupa shel tzedakah, any Jewish community that does not have a kupa shel tzedakah, a communal charity fund, which is where people are assessed. Both the needy are assessed and those who can give are assessed, and they are required to give on a weekly basis as described. Rambam says, I have never heard of a Jewish community where this was not the case, which tells you a great deal about Jewish civilization and Jewish life, that these were such fundamental and universal concepts within the Jewish world that one could literally not find a Jewish community where this was not done. And that is something for all of us to ponder. It was not imposed by necessarily by any kind of police force. While it is true that ideally in ancient times there was a system in place of batei din, of courts, and of shotorim, that is to say, officers of the court, who were able to force the decisions of the court and therefore of the community. So if the community had had put in place such a charitable system, which was expected of every community, and they decided that every family has to give so much based on the assessment of the family's ability to pay. There was often a way of enforcing this, but there are also many, many times throughout history, certainly that this was the rule for most of the last, shall we say, 1,000 years or so, where it was not always the case at all. It was usually not the case that such decisions could be enforced legally, but nevertheless this was the norm. Jews lived according to these rules because it was expected. It was part of being a Jew, part of living in a Jewish community, and such things were not questioned. So this tells you a great deal about, if not the collectivist nature of Jewish life, of life according to the Torah, it does tell you a great deal about the attitude, the Jewish attitude to dealing with societal issues such as poverty and need. Rambam goes on to say that while I have never heard of any community where this system of weekly contributions was not in place and enforced, with regards to the other procedure, the tamchui, which is the daily tithing, there are places, there are communities, there are countries where this is what the Jews do, and there are places where they do not do this. So, put another way, Judaism, Torah Judaism, is not capitalism, as some people at least may understand the term. In other words, it is not some kind of jungle, economic jungle, where it's every man for himself and no one is required to take into account the other. It is certainly light years away from the philosophy of someone like Ayn Rand, who views caring for the other and giving to another person as almost as a crime, which of course is a reaction, an overreaction to communism. Therefore she stressed and went much too far in stressing the importance of the individual and the freedom and autonomy of the individual. But there's no question that Torah most definitely recognizes, and not only recognizes, in fact, that the Torah is the basis and the source of the very concept of the intrinsic worth and sovereignty and autonomy of the individual. And therefore, every individual on the one hand has the right and the duty to make a living and to do so in a manner that he chooses, that he sees fit, in a way that he is capable of doing. Of course, within the guidelines and according to the essential concepts of the Torah. So obviously any form of, any way of making a living which is based on disregarding various aspects of the Torah, that it's in some way dishonest or immoral, etc., that obviously is something that is not permitted according to the Torah. In other words, freedom to act as a free agent in the world, in the economic marketplace, is not absolute, because very few things in human existence are or can be absolute. One example I would mention here is the world of advertising. Advertising, on the one hand, is essential and is legitimate, but for a very, very long time now, in fact going all the way back to the 1920s, this was the concept of advertising was subverted based on Freudian ideas by the cousin or the nephew of Freud, someone by the name of Eddie Bernays. And since that time, advertising has become increasingly immoral and willing to use any and all means in order to sell product. And that is not that may be an extreme form of capitalism, but that is not a legitimate form of economic activity according to the Torah. So on the one hand, the Torah is definitely in favor of and is in fact the foundation of human rights and human freedom and individual liberty. On the other hand, the Torah very much recognizes the need and obligates us, in fact, to care for the needy and to set in place a system both at the communal level and it seems to me quite clear also on the national level, when the Jewish people are a sovereign nation, to set in place a system which is on the one hand equitable and reasonable and on the one hand takes into account the needy and on the other hand does not allow for a situation in which many idle and unworthy people take advantage of such a system to cheat the system, to act in a dishonest, immoral way and to be unproductive and simply to leech off others. Both of these, all such ideas are obviously also opposed, all sorts of behaviors are also opposed to the Torah. So we could sum up and say as follows: Judaism is not capitalism and Judaism is not communism. Judaism is Judaism. Judaism is based on a balance between all of these ideas, and it is in fact the most perfectly refined and correctly balanced system, if properly implemented, that human beings have ever come up with. One other thing I should mention in conclusion is that the underlying idea behind communism, which was to create a situation of equality, of result, of outcome for all members of society. In other words, not equal opportunity, but equal outcome, that everyone should receive the same. The only way to achieve this, and this has been demonstrated historically in the 20th century, the only way to achieve this goal, which is not rational, not feasible, and runs against the grain of human nature and the essential fabric of the world in which we live. The only way to achieve this is literally by mass murder. It was the case both in Stalin's Russia and in communist China, the communist China of Mao, that literally tens of millions of people, quite literally, perhaps as much as in both cases, taking a few other cases into account as well, as many as 100 million people in the 20th century were murdered specifically in order to establish that kind of purist communist society in which all people would be equal, would receive equally according to their needs or according to whatever decisions the autocrats would decide the people and individuals would require. Because this system is so much in opposition to human nature and to the fact that human beings are not the same, are not equal in terms of their abilities, in terms of their capabilities, in terms of their potentials. And this is something which any reasonable person must recognize, because such a system is predicated on disregarding these basic truths of the created world in which we live. Therefore, the only way to bring about such a communist society, which is again not described in any way, shape or form by the Torah, is to enforce it by the most violent and immoral means. And in essence, we see plainly that it is only in societies which are officially atheistic, such as Communist China or Soviet Russia, Only in an atheistic society, based on the principle of atheism as a belief system, so to speak, only in such a society where there is official state-imposed and state-encouraged atheism, and therefore a total breakdown of any moral code, only in such systems, in such societies and such systems, in order to achieve these unreasonable and in fact undesirable results, the only way to go about it is to abandon any kind of morality, which is only possible essentially when you convince yourself that there is no God and no Creator, and go about killing all those who get in your way, in the way of your dream of establishing some kind of heaven on earth. The result, of course, has always proved to be quite the opposite, and that is to say, hell on earth. And that is exactly, precisely the opposite of what the Torah prescribes and what Hashem wishes to see here on earth.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.